In this lecture, we're going to be looking at expenditure gaps. And this happens when the equilibrium GDP is different than the full employment level of GDP. So remember from the last lecture that the equilibrium GDP is when we find where GDP is equal to aggregate expenditures. The full employment GDP we actually talked about back in chapter 9, but we call it the potential GDP, and that's what the GDP would be if the economy was sitting at the natural rate of unemployment, or the full employment level, which tends to be about 5% of unemployment. So think about the full employment GDP as being our normal, and then sometimes the equilibrium GDP is either too low or too high. The first type of expenditure gap is called a recessionary expenditure gap. This is when spending in the economy is too low. So our aggregate expenditures is lower than normal. And the condition, this is what you'll need to remember here, is that the equilibrium GDP is less than the full employment GDP. So right now, the equilibrium GDP is too low. That means the economy's in a recession. It means our unemployment is very high. We also want to think about what the government can do to fix the problem. And what they can do is they can increase government spending or decrease taxes. We'll go into a lot more depth about this in chapter 13. The second type of expenditure gap is called an inflationary expenditure gap, and this is when the equilibrium GDP is too high. So the condition is the equilibrium GDP is higher than the full employment level of GDP. That means there's too much spending or too much aggregate expenditures. So you may be thinking, well, what's wrong with having a higher than normal GDP? And in this chapter, we can't really see the problem because it has to do with the price level. So when our GDP equilibrium is over the full employment GDP, what happens is it causes inflation. That's why we call it an inflationary expenditure gap. And we'll really be able to see the problem when we move to a new model in the next chapter. We're going to add in the price levels, and you'll be able to see the inflation actually happening in that model. It's not something we can see in the aggregate expenditures graph that we're doing in this chapter. And the last thing to keep in mind with an inflationary expenditure gap is how can the government fix the problem? And what they can do is decrease government spending. This will decrease aggregate expenditures and decrease the GDP back to where it should be, or they can increase taxes. Now we're going to see what it looks like on the graphs. So first we're looking at a recessionary expenditure gap. Here they've given us two different lines. The top line is the aggregate expenditures at the full employment level. So if you look at where it hits that 45-degree reference line and then come down, that's labeled as your full employment level. So this is actually where we want to try to stay as an economy. But something has happened in the economy that has pushed us into a recession, and that's happened because spending has fallen. So notice that aggregate expenditures has decreased a bit, and that's pushed our GDP down lower than it would have been. So this right here is our equilibrium GDP. That's happening at 490. So I can tell that this is a recessionary expenditure gap because our equilibrium GDP is less than the full employment GDP. Now I want to give you a heads up that the book does not clarify very well. It will talk about the gap in two different ways. It will talk about the expenditure gap, which is the term I've been using so far, or the GDP gap. And the difference between the two is most obvious on the graph. So the expenditure gap is the change in spending that needs to happen to bring us back to where we should be. So the difference between the two lines here, this vertical part right here, says it's actually 5 billion. So aggregate expenditures is 5 billion too low right here. That's what we call the expenditure gap. We also have the GDP gap, and that's the difference between the two GDP levels. So the difference between the equilibrium GDP and the full employment level of GDP is 20 billion. That's what we would call a GDP gap. When we're working with the GDP gap or the expenditure gap, a lot of times they will give us one or the other, but we won't have both. And we'll need to solve for whichever one that we're missing. So for instance, if they give us the two different GDPs, the 490 and the 510, we can find the GDP gap, that's 20 billion, and you know how to solve for the multiplier already. So let's say our multiplier is 4, then we can solve for the amount that the expenditure gap would need to change to fix the problem. So our expenditure gap is 5 billion. That means our aggregate expenditures is 5 billion too low. So make a note of this equation. This is actually the exact same equation we were using earlier, but I just changed the wording a little bit. So if you get a GDP gap problem, then you know that you can use this formula and where all the pieces go. Now let's look at an inflationary expenditure gap. In this case, our GDP is too high. So our starting point or our full employment level where we want to be at 510 is this lower line here. But something's happened in the economy that has pushed aggregate expenditures up. And so aggregate expenditures has increased by 5 billion. That's our expenditure gap. And it's moved us to this new equilibrium point here where we cross the 45-degree reference line. And that's caused an increase in the GDP level. And if you compare these two numbers, so our full employment GDP is 510, our new equilibrium GDP is 530. The difference between the two is 20 billion. So we have a GDP gap of 20 billion, and we have an inflationary expenditure gap of 5 billion. And we can tell it's inflationary because the equilibrium GDP is higher than the full employment level of GDP. So GDP is too high, that means it's in inflationary gap. Here's a simple example for you to try. It says the current equilibrium GDP is 200 billion and the full employment GDP is 240 billion. So you're going to decide, is the economy in a recessionary or an inflationary gap? And then use the formula I gave you a little bit ago to figure out what change in aggregate expenditures is needed to fix the problem. So you're going to find the GDP gap from the problem. You're going to find the multiplier. You're given the MPC. Remember how to solve for the multiplier. And then solve for the expenditure gap, and you'll get your answer. One more thing I want to mention here is a lot of times when you're doing these problems that you will have to find equilibrium GDP first. And that's what we learned how to do in the last lecture. So you'll be solving for the equilibrium GDP normally, and then they'll always give you the full employment level of GDP, and then you're able to compare the two. Okay, pause the video here and try the problem. First thing in this problem is to decide if we're in a recessionary or an inflationary gap. In this case, the economy is in a recessionary gap, and we can tell because the current GDP is less than the full employment level of GDP. Next, we can solve for the needed change in aggregate expenditures to fix the problem or to fix the gap. And to do that, we're going to use this formula here. The GDP gap is equal to the multiplier times the aggregate expenditures gap. The aggregate expenditures gap is what we're going to be solving for. First, we're going to solve for the multiplier, which we've done multiple times already. If you remember from the last chapter, the multiplier is 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, and it gives us our MPC of 0.625. So if you plug that in the multiplier equation, you should get 2.67. And I rounded here. We actually have a lot of 6s repeating. When you get down and you use this further on in the problem, I would suggest not rounding. So just keep all those 6s when we plug it in. The next thing that we need is the GDP gap. Remember, the GDP gap is the difference between the current equilibrium GDP and the full employment level of GDP. So we're going to find the difference between these two values. So our GDP gap is going to be 240 minus 200 billion, and that gives us 40 billion. Then we can take that number and plug it into our GDP gap. So what we end up with is 40 billion is equal to our 2.67 times the aggregate expenditures gap. And to solve for this here, we just need to divide both sides by the 2.67. If you do that, you should get somewhere near 15 billion, depending on how you round it. If you divide 40 billion divided by 2 and then keep all of those 6s, you would get exactly 15 billion, which is the answer. And there actually is one more step, because we need to think about if we're going to increase or decrease the aggregate expenditures. So because right now the equilibrium GDP is too low and the economy is in a recession, to pull us out of the recession and to get back to that higher full employment GDP where we want to be, we need to increase aggregate expenditures by the 15 billion. This concludes chapter 11. In the next chapter, we're going to be building on this information, but we're going to use a new model that's called the aggregate demand to aggregate supply model, where we add in the price level, and we'll be able to see what happens with inflation or deflation in the economy.